What if I told you that the biggest drug lord in history is not Pablo Escobar or El Chapo? I'm talking about a man who was the biggest drug lord in history, who started wars, destroyed civilizations, and corrupted governments. They called him the Rothschild of the East. He built a business empire that made him the richest man in Asia, but his immense wealth came from a far more sinister trade, one that brought misery and ruin to millions. Be sure to stick around till the end to learn how he lured one nation to wage war on another so he can profit from it. David Sassoon was the biggest drug lord in history who forced nations to wage war for his narcotic trafficking profits. This is the appalling, untold story of the Merchant of Death, who left a legacy of blood and addiction spanning the globe. David Sassoon, the Merchant of Death, the biggest drug peddler in history has ever seen. He has public places named after him in the world, but his legacy is stained with blood, misery, and corruption. David Sassoon was born in Baghdad in 1792 into a wealthy Jewish family. His father was a banker who had close ties with the Ottoman Empire. But when the empire collapsed and the governor of Baghdad was overthrown, the Sassoons faced persecution and violence. They fled to Bombay, India, where they established a new business empire under the protection of the British East India Company. The British government, under Queen Victoria, granted several exclusive rights to the Sassoon family to manufacture and trade cotton goods, silk, and most importantly, opium. Opium was the most addictive and profitable drug of its time, and the Sassoons had a monopoly over its production and distribution. They forced farmers in North India and other parts of Asia to grow opium instead of food crops, causing widespread famine and poverty. They then processed the opium on an industrial scale and sold it to various countries, especially China and Japan. The Sassoons found a huge market for opium in China, where they imported tea in exchange. But their trade was not only lucrative, but also devastating. The opium trade to China saw a huge rise between 1830 and 1831, and a large part of the profit went to Queen Victoria herself. By 1880, the opium trade had skyrocketed to 105,508 chests, making the Sassoons the richest Jews in the world next to the Rothschilds. But the opium trade also had a terrible impact on the Chinese people and society. Millions of Chinese became addicted to opium, which impaired their health, productivity, and morale. The Chinese government saw the opium trade as a threat to their sovereignty and security and tried to ban it in 1839. This angered the Sassoons and the East India Company, who wanted to continue their lucrative business at any cost. Through persistent lobbying, Sassoon convinced the British Governor-General of India, Lord Auckland, to declare war on China. Auckland wrote to Queen Victoria that Sassoon besieged me with every conceivable argument to compel military action against China's opium suppression efforts. Greedy for the tax revenues from Sassoon's trade, the British willingly embraced conflict. Their goals were to forcibly open all of China to the opium trade and make millions of new addicts. In 1840, Britain declared war on China and easily won with its naval superiority. Britain defeated China in the First Opium War in 1842 and imposed a humiliating treaty on them. The 1842 Treaty of Nanjing concluded the First Opium War with China's humiliating defeat. As well as ceding Hong Kong to Britain, China was forced to pay indemnities of $21 million, a sum that unjustly bailed out British traders for the cost of their lost opium cargo. The punitive terms also forcibly opened 5 Chinese ports to foreign trade. Sassoon and other British merchants immediately took advantage, flooding a defenseless China with even higher volumes of Indian opium. Addiction and desperation ravaged Chinese society, while men like Sassoon only grew richer from the suffering and colonized trade. Hong Kong became the hub of the opium trade route to the entire world. After continued disputes over treaty violations and Britain's refusal to stop the opium smuggling, Sassoon played another central role, triggering an even deadlier Second Opium War in 1856. This time, the arrogant merchant had himself appointed as a meeting delegate alongside British military leaders to threaten the Chinese with violent consequences over trade obstacles. The resulting conflict saw the further erosion of Chinese sovereignty, more territorial losses, legalization of the opium trade, destitution among the masses, deaths of millions, and the solidification of violent Western imperialism across Asia. The Opium Wars were some of the bloodiest and most unjust wars that Britain ever fought, to have the right to sell drugs to the Chinese masses. Thus began the century of humiliation and impoverishment for China. Britain and other Western powers exploited and oppressed China for their own interests, while the Chinese people suffered from addiction, poverty, and corruption. Britain also forced the Chinese to smoke opium, sometimes at gunpoint, to ensure their dependency and submission. The Sassoons, with the help of Britain, drugged an entire nation and looted their wealth. Their opium trade brought death and destruction to millions and still plagues Asia to this day. Cruelty of this kind is way above anyone's imagination. This is the true story of David Sassoon, the merchant of death, the biggest drug peddler history has ever seen. He may have public places named after him in the world, but his name will always be associated with shame, greed, and evil. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more episodes.